Hello again, friends. I'm happy to be back with you. I asked Mr. Spinola if I could do another video to follow up on the introduction I gave you to macroeconomics, and he graciously said that he would allow me to do that, and I really appreciate that. I really appreciate having the opportunity to to help out in this situation. Well, the last time that we had a video, um, I introduced macroeconomics to you, and I told you that there were really two big issues in macroeconomics. One was long run growth, and the other was short run instability. And I focused towards the end of that discussion on short run instability. And what I argued was in the short run, there's a consistent pattern over time. That is, the level of GDP tends to rise, peak, right? And when it peaks, there's full employment and sometimes a threat of inflation. And then inevitably, there's some sort of decline, a recession, where GDP falls. Two consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth represents a recession. And then it bottoms and troughs, recovers and peaks, and that's the pattern it follows. Now, this short run instability is a big issue, obviously. When we're in recession, people suffer. And so macroeconomics focuses on some level on explaining or attempting to explain why that occurs and providing some explanations of what, if anything, should or could be done about it. Now, you'll get into that. But in the meantime, the first step in sort of understanding that instability is to understand the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. And we said that's the basic model that economists use to explain the level of output and the level of prices. The level of output is ultimately GDP, and that's going to determine the level of employment, or unemployment, and the level of prices is going to determine inflation. So the major standards of economic health are determined by the forces of aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Now, this week you're looking at both, right? And first you're looking at aggregate demand. And I just want to briefly mention a few things about aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is the total sum whole of desire of goods and services by all the actors in the economy at a given time. So everyone's desire for goods and services constitutes the aggregate demand. Aggregate means sum total whole of, right? So the aggregate demand for goods and services in the economy is the whole demand, everyone. Now, typically we divide that demand into four parts, four components of aggregate demand, and these are fairly important. The biggest and most important component of aggregate demand arguably is consumer demand or consumption. And that's usually represented by a capital C, an uppercase C. Consumption represents the desire of consumers like you and I for all of the goods and services that we might want to purchase at a given time, right? So consumption includes, or consumer demand consumption includes, our demand for automobiles and tacos and clothing or whatever other goods or services, haircuts, whatever we might demand. Cumulatively together, that represents consumption. The second component of aggregate demand is business demand or investment. Now, investment is represented in the formula as a uppercase I with a sub G, I sub G, right? Now, I sub G represents investment spending, and that's business spending, but specific business spending. Business demand in this instance refers to business demand for capital, those man-made things that are used to make other things. So businesses can demand lots of intermediate goods, that they use to construct something. A restaurant might buy ham and cheese and bread in order to make sandwiches, but that ham, cheese, and bread that they're demanding to make sandwiches is not a part of business demand, right? What constitutes business demand or investment, I sub G, is business demand for capital, those goods that are used to make other goods, like the sandwich maker or the cash register in the business. That's business demand or investment, I sub G. Then you have government. Government demand is self-explanatory. It's the demand of government at every level for the goods and services that they purchase. They purchase a lot of things, right? I mean, they purchase office supplies, they purchase, nuclear weaponry, airplanes, whatever. The government on the national level and the local level, buy a lot of things, right? And so government is represented by an uppercase G. And then lastly, there's the demand of foreigners, right? So we know that Italians demand, you know, hang on,